Hello everyone. This is the podcast about digital fatalism. Today I'm talking to Dr Ola Michalec, Dr Andrés Domínguez and Dr Peter Winter, who lead a project called Against Digital Fatalism with Bristol Digital Futures Institute at Bristol Uni and the Alan Turing Institute. And this episode brings a special focus to technology hype and narratives circulated in the mainstream media and by the most powerful technology companies in their marketing strategies, and how these narratives shape our expectations about technology as well as fears. Their project is positioned as a critical digital literacy initiative. It began in 2023 with a call for artists to take part in a 6-month residency, and those artists were Kate Colley, Wen Lee and George Sims. So we start the conversation with what they mean when they talk about digital fatalism.
Digital fatalism, I think when we started with this project, we associated this term with technological hype and these kind of grand narratives about the future that circulate in the media and that are amplified and created by these big personalities, big tech personalities, Elon Musk, etc. But it's about this kind of sense of inevitability that is conveyed in these narratives, and that the future is a foregone conclusion, is pre-written, and there's nothing we can do about it. So digital fatalism kind of came out of thinking about what impact does these type of narratives have on people in kind of their feelings about the future and how we imagine the future will be like, and what agency or lack of agency people have. So when you're painted this future picture of the world, what does that tell you when powerful people say things are going to be like that, and you just kind of throw your hands in the air and this is what the future is going to be like if they say it, because they have all this power?
Yeah, I'd say I think it's because we all come from the similar background from science and technology studies. We looked at fatalism as a conceptual thing, you know. We tend to analyze hype, the life cycle of it. How come these narratives are so popular and how come they then die down, and the whole wide array of emotions behind the scenes that maybe you will not see in the glossy narratives that you get then in the media. But I guess since we're mere social scientists, all we do is interview people, sometimes run focus groups. I think definitely personally, I found that there is a need to do something beyond problematizing and analyzing hype. Hence our turn to creative methods as something that we can do on top of the usual social science methods.
I was wondering, whether your choice to work with artists, is that because you see their methods as being countering fatalism?
That's a good question. I think building on Ola's point, there's a lot of interest in our field in science and technology studies about hype and critiquing hype and looking at the social and political implications of it, and how hype is able to mobilize investment, for example, and how it manages to get into policymaking. But we were more interested in kind of this affective impact on people, and how do we take these critiques from the academic discourse into more kind of public engagement spaces. So that kind of was our thinking behind engaging artists as a way to kind of look into different mediums to mobilize academic critique that could be perhaps a little bit abstract, and try to engage people with these ideas about, not take for granted these hype narratives, what you can do about it, this idea of taking back control about the future, actively shaping the future, and reflecting about kind of your own positionality and role in shaping the future, not just as a kind of part of the market and kind of reacting as a part of the market, but also in terms of how do you inform your own political stances about technology and your own action in every day. So that was kind of the strategy, and it was very experimental, the way we went about it, and we can talk more about that, but that was kind of the motivation to reach out to artists.
Why do you think it was so important to look at this topic? What was the seed of the project? How did you get to the point where you were writing that application to set the project up in the first place?
At the time where we were writing the application for the project, I remember there was a lot of hype around the metaverse. It was at the time where Facebook was being rebranded to Meta, and it was exactly because of these grand narratives or predictions about the next stage of the internet. So Mark Zuckerberg was kind of saying something like the metaverse is going to be the next mobile internet or something like that. And there was so much conviction around that they changed their whole company. They changed the whole name of the company to Meta, and they were putting a lot of investment in VR. So there was a huge wave of hype around virtual reality and metaverse technologies. Obviously, as social sciences, we're kind of interested in the implications of that and also the harms that could create. So we had some research behind that, for example, about challenges around toxicity going on in the metaverse, or how do you moderate toxic behavior in it, implications around privacy and surveillance, etc. So that's kind of what motivated this first attempt to mobilize critiques about hype. What you'll see in the products of this project are different takes on social issues arising as a result of virtual reality and the metaverse.
The three of us, we've never formally worked together, despite being friends for a couple of years. We've organized a conference session, but that's about it. It's not quite formalized, funded project. And every now and again, our university at the time for all of us would be organizing SeedCorn calls, which would be awards in the range of 5 to 15 grand, depending on the round you sign up to. And I guess also kind of from a pragmatic stance, it was an opportunity to experiment with something that was feasible within that budget. So again, doing social science research in terms of interviews and transcribing that and then analyzing it takes years usually, and it's completely different kind of order of magnitude when it comes to funding. So we thought, well, why don't we commission 3 emerging artists and give them not a tight brief, but tight project in a way that we just wanted to give them one piece to deliver, and we take care of the rest in terms of how those pieces then speak to each other and making a brochure and so on and so on.
And could you talk some about like the artists that you work with? Because one of them works with VR, right, as well?
Yeah, I can start with Kate Colley. She's a nature filmmaker, and she has usually worked, with filming some really beautiful exotic locations and films around, saving the planet and environmental issues. So she wanted to take this theme, but extend it to the notion of VR and the question of, imagine a very far away future where maybe the nature is not as abundant, as diverse as it used to be. If you were able to access it via VR, say maybe because you don't have the financial means to do it, or because you're disabled, or any other reasons, doesn't matter that this is all not real. So it's kind of a little bit flippant, a little bit subversive. The film is only 3 minutes long, but it's so full of imagery, so full of questions, and I would say quite ambiguous. And I think it really encourages the viewers to ask for themselves about the potential, but also the kind of irony of VR, let's say.
I can talk about our second artist. I worked closely with Weng Li, and just to say, we also work with all the artists together as well in workshops where we allow them also to get feedback to each other and to kind of hear from each other's experiences, which was really good actually in the experience of the process. But as Ola said, we kind of took time to accompany each of the artists in their own creative practice. So Weng Li is, I hope I do justice to her background, because I think she's multidisciplinary artist in the sense that she experiments with visual imagery, but also with kind of digital artifacts. So in this particular project, she took on the massive challenge of developing a VR game in record time, because we gave them, I think, a little bit over 6 months maybe to finish their projects. And she developed a VR game from scratch that you can play on the VR headset. And she also is very interested in political science and in reading kind of academic literature. So in that game, she wanted to critique this practice of voting or simulating democracy within virtual worlds. And it's something that she's been interested in video games that exist, that have been there for a while, like Decentraland is. So she kind of was speaking to this engineered, in a way, kind of corruption about the system, whereby people who have more digital assets in the virtual world are able to exercise more voting power. So she kind of simulates that in the game and lets you take a role where you either have too few resources or too many resources that you are able to sway the vote in the direction that you want if you have enough power. So that was quite interesting, and she managed to build it in record time. I think it's really amazing the work that she did. You can play the game. The idea was to kind of bring this to the public and get everyone to interact with it and get this problematizing that she was bringing up which was quite great. And it was really rewarding to work with her as well.
The artist that I was working with is George Sims, and basically finishing off a PhD in queer and crip collective methods towards automated sociotechnical infrastructure. Basically designing a prototype of crip infrastructuring called Cozy Cloud. And it's essentially a social digital space setup maintained by and for disabled people. And it's basically like a federated social platform that's installed online and has hosted on a portable server. And the idea of it that people can ultimately access this virtual space, and by extension use it to do anything that they would like, how we would ultimately use the internet. But the idea is also that it's cushioned by soft infrastructure externally, like a sofa or bean bags or cushions and certain types of lights for, I don't know, neurodivergent people and things like that. So the idea was ultimately like, well, let's try and make a safe, cozy and comfortable space for people with different types of disabilities, visual impairments, cognitive impairments, physical disabilities, by ensuring that they have a space physically in the real world with their own cozy infrastructure that they can use, but also that they also feel safe through this federated social platform as well. And yeah, he kind of wanted to really kind of help better or make crip experiences better, really, as opposed to, hegemonic big tech fantasies that Andrés was talking about earlier, really. And, this is the whole point of the Fatalism project, is that, we don't want to impose a negative or positive or some kind of intermediary notion of what fatalism means or a digital future. But that was the real good thing about this project, was that we allowed these artists through co-production to kind of go, well, what are your visions for the future through your digital methods and your digital technology? Are you presenting it through perhaps a pessimistic view or an optimistic? And I think with George in particular, George Sims, my artist, presenting something quite optimistic.
In any way, was it responding to like a perceived lack of disabled people being involved in the development of technology?
I think so, yeah, absolutely. I think George is disabled and has health issues and is experiencing this lack of access and support, and just the way the world is shaped around us, that it doesn't accommodate people who are different.
And what are your thoughts on the historic roots of digital fatalism? I mean, from like what you said, I'm sort of assuming, if you start with the height, it's from this kind of like commercialism and that approach to developing technology and how investment drives what products are made. What are your thoughts around that?
I'm not a historian, so I wouldn't say I can provide a definite theory of that. I think there's something around the disillusionment with the early web technologies. Back when social media were first a thing, and there was a promise of platforms providing connection and democratizing opportunities, and anyone could be a creator, anyone could be connected with anyone in the world. And that then in a way got captured for advertising, that the kind of we soon realized that Facebook is not a connecting platform, but it's an advertising platform. And that led to a whole lot of feeling of fatalism, that this sort of dynamics is reproduced in other digital technologies. So for example, Cory Doctorow has this term called entritification, about how digital products, which are initially positioned as attractive to users and they have all these extra perks and they're free to use, once platforms lock users in and they are essentially monopolists, suddenly all these nice extra perks are removed and actually your user experience is like ever so worse. So yeah, he kind of gives examples of that entritification theory with lots of digital platforms. I think is definitely something that we as day-to-day users have been experiencing. If we know anyone who has a computer or smartphone has been entritified, sorry for the words. And within that, to add to this idea of entritification, I think there is also this permanent notion of crisis that I think at least since the financial crisis, there is this news reporting, about crisis to do with security, with war, with migration, with climate. There's just this crazy, chaotic, emotional sense that we just going from one trouble to another. And as individuals, we've got very little agency. So in our work, we first of all wanted to interrogate that, actually problematize it, if that's really the case. Initially, I must say, maybe, I don't know about others, but I had a little bit of a turn with the kind of hype and hope dichotomy. So I think, as you can see in the title of the project, was Against Digital Fatalism, being developing hopeful interventions or something like that. But the word hope was in the title. And I think I'm starting to think that maybe it's not actually about the dichotomy between hype and hope. So a very useful example from that is a panel session from the STS conference called EAST, which is European Association for Studies of Science and Technology. We went in Amsterdam and we presented at the panel about hope. And our positioning was kind of very weird because our presentation came after a really amazing presentation from a Palestinian-born Canadian doctor who worked in Palestine. And so, I mean, obviously very, very different products, and not even trying to compare them. But they had this really interesting project about 3D printed medicine in Palestine, which, happened way, way before the kind of the freshest wave of attacks from Israel. So that was like an old project. And they were, in the presentation, they were trying to say how they had to completely rescope the whole projects in the last year because of all those atrocities which happened, and how they initially tried to do this kind of like hopeful research project about 3D printing and so on. It turned out to be just about very basic day-to-day solidarity and, trying to like keep things alive, keep people alive, and the very interesting takeaway they had from that is, under some circumstances, in some situation, well, actually, hope is a little bit naive. It's just a little bit simplistic that, the best you can do is solidarity with people who are affected by various crises. And I wonder to what extent we could also, reflect that. Can we also draw any other responses beyond this hype and hope? And I'm not sure that we have an answer to that, but I think what we saw in the artist responses, that they're not necessarily all positive or all negative. I would say they sit in the kind of various shades of ambiguity. And hopefully they can start as a platform for future conversations about what's other responses beyond hype and hope we can encourage in the society.
What is the response to digital fatalism, or what is the opposite of digital fatalism? We don't have an answer to, and it's what we are seeking to explore experimentally. But going back to the historical roots, I think I very much agree with Ola. I think it's interesting to look at the history of computing in general, and how the trajectory of computing, or the grand narratives of computing, have evolved and have kind of normalized hype in a way. And when looking at this question, I thought about Moore's law, for example, this kind of early prediction about how microcontrollers would evolve is kind of this simple extrapolation of looking at empirical data of how microcontrollers are getting better. And this kind of became a sort of prediction that turned into a roadmap or a target for the industry, where the industry is kind of trying to make microcontrollers twice as good every couple of years, or every year, as was the prediction. And kind of this is the reason why this becomes a law, or something that has to happen. There is this kind of implicit technological determinism that is so present in many of these narratives about computing, and this is very much prevalent today. Every day we hear very confident claims about the future. Just 2 months ago, I think, was Sam Altman making yet another prediction that superintelligence is going to arrive in a few thousand days, I think, or Elon Musk saying that it's a matter of 5 to 10 years before we have super intelligent machines. And I think that kind of impacts the way the public understands technology, this kind of public engagement with what the future is. But yeah, it raises the question of how, if that is problematic and that creates this kind of digital fatalism, how do you counteract? How do you react to that? What is kind of the political response to that? And there is a lot of productive responses and a lot of activism and a lot of action in the form of protests, like for protesting technology being used for genocide, for example, and critical thinking in different places about technology and experimenting and hacking and taking control, which is kind of what Peter was alluding to with the work of George, which is interesting. And I think that's where we could perhaps start looking looking at some of the political and material responses to hype that come from the bottom up.
So would you say that you're kind of leaning towards, in terms of like your project, how it's affected how you think about how optimistic or pessimistic you are in terms of challenging digital fatalism? Would that suggest that you're slightly leaning towards the more optimistic through these kind of like artistic interventions and strategies? Or the role of artists in these conversations anyway?
I'm not sure that I would particularly position myself on the kind of pessimist or optimistic spectrum. I think to me it's more about recognizing where you have an agency as individuals over what issues and trying to, improve or maximize your agency if you want to, feel particular way and influence particular issues. Because to me, the kind of the feeling of the societal, the cultural background that we have about anxiety and doom, the world is going to end, mostly stems from people, incapacity to affect anything. And, in a way, we've got very little agency, any kind of international politics, even national politics, there's very little we can do. So I think here is the response is either to accept what you cannot do on the kind of international, national scale, or to, pursue career activism or, any causes where you can genuinely affect something. But I think the worst you can do is to despair, because you've got the best of both the worst of both worlds. So yeah, to me, it's not so much about pessimism, optimism, but about recognizing the agency.
I echo that. For me personally, I use fatalism or this against this digital fatalism almost as a theory methods package to help me manage going down or managing my prejudice or bias and not getting sucked into any of the more mainstream media narratives of doom and gloom and also optimism. I think it's important, especially if we call ourselves academics, to not go down either way. If we want to kind of think critically about this, we need to have an open mind of all viewpoints. And for me, it's a good way of managing the bad news that is out there, but also having hope with technological progress as well, because we should be grateful with all the innovation that is going out there, and there's a lot of good being done with innovation and research. So for me, I almost use it as a kind of a means to manage the sea of discourses that are out there, as perhaps Adele Clark would say. And also, I find it useful to manage my own bias and my own prejudice and not get sucked into the doom and gloom, for example, that seems to be hitting us, every morning, every day when we put the news on. So it's a really good means to manage the discourse that's out there.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think digital fatalism has this kind of ambivalent meaning to it. Future predictions could be doom and gloom, but they could also be utopian predictions about how society will be and everything will be amazing with technology. And fatalism is a kind of just blind acceptance of either of those, even if it's positive or negative. But it has this implication that no matter what happens, there's nothing we can do. So I think our take on kind of resisting that is about regaining a little bit of control and agency. And that's why I think hope is kind of a recurrent theme. It keeps coming back in that sense, because in exploring what you can do and in critiquing and in resisting, you get a little bit of a sense of empowerment, and that you can do something and that the future is not prescribed and pre-decided. So in that sense, I think there is some sort of optimism in there embedded in this idea of wanting to take action and doing something through the means of critical literacy, or through the means of critical journalism, getting a different narrative out there. It has a sense that you might want to change something and you might want a different kind of future. So yeah, it's hard to put it in that binary, but I think these are definitely recurrent themes that come as a reaction to digital fatalism.
Do you think that digital fatalism is inevitable? What kind of society do we need to collectively create in order to resist digital fatalism, as we're talking about it in terms of apathy, and what do we need? What kind of infrastructures do we need to challenge it?
Yeah, I think it's exactly the kind of common thread that we had through this project. We often kind of pitched it as critical digital literacy initiative. So we kind of wanted to convey this critique to technological determinism, or this critique of hype, through different means, and explore what we can do about it. Because it's very easy for these big figures to make predictions about the future and portray a future, and it's hard to contest that. It's hard to have an argument against that, because predictions about the future are not based in evidence, always are not falsifiable predictions. So how do you arm people with tools to resist that? So how do you come up with different narratives, or how do you come up with actual points of leverage to do something about that when you're facing these very powerful discourses and very powerful figures? So that's the element within there about critical scholarship and critical digital literacy being mobilized to the public. And within there is an assumption that fatalism itself is not inevitable, that these predetermined futures are not inevitable. So kind of expanding the vocabulary that we have within social science and critical scholarship, and the means that we have and the mediums that we have to mobilize that critique, I think has been the common thread in this project.
To add to that and to leave the listeners with any recommendations, there's so many really interesting digital-oriented projects happening, both locally and globally. So, well, first of all, I find social media really interesting. How I told you earlier about this gentrification theory and how we locked into platforms, but this locking again itself is not inevitable. So you perhaps it's not news anymore, but since Donald Trump has become a president, just thousands or maybe even millions of people are leaving Twitter. It's no longer this kind of dominant platform. It's still pretty big, but I think there is a bit of a momentum that to go elsewhere. And I think if you're the kind of person who likes social media for whatever reason, but don't want to be on Twitter, I think it hasn't been a better time to choose an alternative, whether that's Mastodon or Blue Sky or, any other, ideally decentralized platform that is not owned by a billionaire. In terms of entertainment, there is, for example, gaming industry is a really interesting one. Again, it has very close ties to extractive labor, to unsustainable computing, to, lithium battery and so on, especially the kind of the big game producers. But equally, there's lots of really interesting indie gaming studio, which not only create interesting narratives or interesting game mechanics, but also are built in an ethical manner. So, for example, a book by Mariam Did about the future of video game industry is a really interesting one to explore, our games themselves. And finally, if you're interested in actually doing stuff with electronics, with computers, there is these thing called maker spaces, which are pretty much around the world, which offer people, free or low cost access to electronics, 3D printing, and sometimes skills building workshops. For example, in Bristol, we've got this thing called Dorkbot, which is actually, it's a branch of international talks. And once a month, people meet in a city center venue, and they bring the kind of like weird electronic gadgets that they make. And it's really wonderful because most of these things, they don't really have like a very utilitarian motivation. It's just something that people do out of joy, out of play. And I think there is something really precious about this sense of joy and playfulness that we used to have with computers, with electronics, that we should not let go of so easily.
This podcast has been supported by Northern Bridge Consortium, which is funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. If you like listening to the episode, let me know what you think. You can always get in touch with me, K.Woods, via the website digitalfatalism.net. Thanks.